I was lucky enough to start telling stories on the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields in 2000. And it would be fair to say that I have some background with Zulu people. I grew up speaking Zulu, playing with Zulu children on farms. My nursemaid was Zulu. I spoke Zulu alongside English before I went to school. And on account of that, I was fortunate enough to serve with Zulu troops during my national service at 121 Battalion, based at Matuba in Zululand, during my 2 years with the South African Defence Force. And I think that there has intrinsically always been some special link and interest for me with these great warrior people. It goes much further than that. A quite remarkable man, member of Mensa with an unusually high IQ, called Donald R. Morris, worked for the CIA in Berlin, an American, a Texan at that. And he had a great friend in the form of Ernest Hemingway, and they used to spend much time together. And one day Hemingway was down in the Bahamas. There he went often in search of big game fish, and Donald Morris joined him there. And Morris said, I've been reading about this tribe of people in Africa, and I have become obsessed with them. And Hemingway said, that wouldn't be the Zulus, would it? And Morris said, yes, it is. And Morris said, I'm really battling to find more information on them, and particularly about this remarkable battle. And Hemingway said, that wouldn't be Isandlwana, would it? And Morris replied, it is. And Hemingway said, you know, there's very little written about this great battle and these remarkable people. Perhaps you should write a book yourself. Now, these days were the early 1960s, long before email or anything like that. So Donald Morris, with this thought in his mind, returns to Berlin, and he writes a letter to Kelly Campbell, the remarkable woman who started the Kelly Campbell Archive and Museum in Durban. Kelly Campbell had an early morning habit of enjoying her tea while she opened her post. And sitting opposite her on the other side of her desk was a young, fresh-faced ranger with his magnificent blue eyes, none other than Ian Player. And as she read through this letter of inquiry from a mad American based in Berlin, asking for information about the Zulus, with particular reference to the Zulu War, she slid this letter across the table to Ian Player and she said, you and your friend Makubu Ntombela, you're so interested in the Zulu people and their culture, why don't you pick up the baton and run with this inquiry from this American who I've never heard of previously. And out of it came this book. It's a tome, really, called The Washing of the Spears. Initially hit the shelves in 1963, marginally before that great movie Zulu that immortalized Michael Caine's career about the Battle of Rorke's Drift. But if you want to read a great book about the rise and fall of the Zulu people, this book, The Washing of the Spears, cannot be recommended highly enough. With these things in mind, I turn my attention and my thoughts to another man, a white man called George Bunting, who was born to a family of very modest means on the Kuteni Mountain. Now, the Kuteni Mountain has on its top a rain shadow. The eastern side of the mountain facing the Indian Ocean gets fantastic rain. But the rain dwindles off on the top of the mountain. They get an average of around 13 inches a year, an impossible place to farm. And his parents battled a long time to fall pregnant, and eventually in 1911 they were born a son. And that little boy, aged 6 in 1917, was sent off to boarding school in Durban. Now, the only way to get him to school was by train, but the railhead was at Glencoe on the other side of Dundee, some 120 miles, 200 kilometers from the farm. Well, this required that George, at age 6, was sent off in the hand of one of their Zulu employees for a horse ride to catch the train at Glencoe. The horse ride took 3 days, 2 nights on the ride, and the first night on the ride, they would find themselves in the wagon park of that famous battlefield at the southern end of the mountain of Isandlwana. And they would knee-hold to their horses, and they would scramble up onto the mountain and find some twigs. There was a real shortage of firewood to boil up a little billy of tea. And then they'd come down and sit around their fire. They didn't even have saddles, these poor folk. just a horse blanket, and they sat on the horse blanket. And this old Zulu would begin to regale young George Bunting, who was fluent in Zulu, with the stories of what had happened that Wednesday afternoon. And he spoke of the blood and the guts, the glory, the eclipse of the sun. Now, it would be fair to say at this point that this old Zulu was a Shezi. Shezis enjoy a particularly prominent part in Zulu history. And this young man, Shezi, had fought for the Imbonambi regiment, part of the left horn of the Zulu army at Isandlwana. And he had come into the battle. They'd driven Durnford and his horsemen back from the Donga all the way back to the southern flank of the camp, where desperate fight ensued. Durnford and his men were fighting with their bayonets, and the Zulus were obliged to pick up dead bodies of their comrades and throw them onto the bayonet to try and get the bayonet down, that they could stab the man beyond that bayonet. But this old Zulu told George Bunting that in the middle of the battle, right in the middle of the head and chest of the Zulu regiments, was a young regiment called the Umqejo, who were 30 to 33 years of age, dying to get into the thick of the fight, to bathe their assegais in blood, that they be afforded the privilege of woman and marriage and glory when they got home. And they were being so smashed by British rifle and cannon fire coming off the British firing line that they were about to turn and withdraw. And had they withdrawn, they may well have precipitated a mass withdrawal of Zulus as the middle of that line broke, and other Zulu records concur with this. Their old commander, a man called Umkosana Kamvundlana of the Biela clan, stood up with his old grey kaross around his shoulders and his kokwa head ring in his hair, and the lion's claw necklace, the Royal Award for Bravery, round his neck. And he strode through his men to the front. He turned his back on the British firing line, and he faced his young warriors, and he bellowed at them. He shouted, "Yeninelapia, ninga baleg, selo ushahlana bulalumle, ungashonga njalo." You men, don't run. The king, the small branch that extinguishes the flames, that was one of King Cetshwayo's praise names. He gave us no such order. Do you know that he'd hardly uttered that cry when much of his head was carried away by a British bullet and he fell dead? But the rallying cry had been made and heard by his regiment and the regiments adjacent to it. And Shezi explained to young George Bunting that in this great moment of bravery and sacrifice of his own life in attempting to rally the Zulus, that they would rise up like a great black wave, and fall on that thin red British firing line. This little boy, George Bunting, sat there transfixed by these and other stories. And as he grew, he would find his way back to Glencoe on the train, head out of the window looking on the platform for his old friend. And there he was with a spare horse. And he and the survivor from the Battle of Isandlwana would set off on that epic 3-day ride back to that modest farm on the top of the Kuteni, not all that far from Nkandla. You probably wonder where the relevance of this story lies in all this. Well, George Bunting grew up to become one of the great experts and authorities on Zulu culture and Zulu people. They called him a Chitu Kumani, friend of the Zulus. Heads of state and potentates used to come and visit at his humble little farmhouse to sit around his table and hear from this white man who knew these stories better than anyone else, what had happened on that day and what had happened subsequently in the Anglo-Zulu War. And a young boy who was intrigued by Uncle George, much as George Bunting had been intrigued by his old Zulu chaperone Shezi, was none other than David Rattray, who used to spend his long weekends and holidays going out on these battlefields to hear the stories that George had heard firsthand from Zulu survivors, most notably Shezi. And David Rattray was adamant that if these stories were shared as Uncle George shared them with him, surely people would want to come and hear these stories. And in that thought and in that motion began what became the famous Fugitives Drift. And David said Uncle George used to stand up at the end of the table telling a story, and he would pick up a fork off the table, and he would begin, whilst telling his story, to clean his fingernails with a fork. And I've been present when people have asked David Rattray if he remembers much of what Uncle George told him, and David said, not really. I was too terrified that I might have that fork in the morning. And this tradition of storytelling, particularly about the Battle of Isandlwana, is crucial to us. White men fled early on. Most of them fled on horseback to save their own lives. The bulk of the men in that battle on the British and colonial side were killed. So we rely on the Zulu tradition of handing down their stories orally from generation to generation to try and piece this great Victorian battle piece together. And it is in this, I believe, that the real magic lies. The retelling of these stories passed down from generation to generation verbally, ideally round a fire, of these great experiences of yesteryear. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you will continue to follow me on Patreon. Thank you very much indeed.